Alrighty, hi everyone, good morning, and welcome to today's session, which is hosted by the National Milk Producers Federation's National Young Cooperators Program. We are thrilled to have you join us for what promises to be an insightful discussion on farm transition planning, a topic of vital importance to ensuring the future success of our dairy industry. Before we dive into today's session, I would like to take a moment to express our deep gratitude to Farm Credit for their generous year-round sponsorship and support. Their partnership is critical to empowering the next generation of dairy farmer leaders, and we are truly thankful for their continued commitment to this mission. Today's discussion will focus on the challenges and opportunities that come with transitioning dairy farm ownership and management. Whether you're in the early stages of thinking about succession, or actively working on a transition plan, you'll hear firsthand from dairy farmers who have navigated these waters. They will share not only what worked, but what didn't, and the bumps they encountered along the way, providing you with lessons learned and strategies to build a stronger future for your farm. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's session facilitators, Jay Joy and Bruce Vande. Jay is the founder and managing partner of Bridgeforth LLP, where he brings a wealth of experience guiding agribusiness transitions. From his time in banking to managing large dairy operations and serving as CFO for a family-owned farming business, Jay has dedicated his career to improving the financial health and decision-making of his clients in agriculture. Bruce Vande is our co-facilitator, is a business advisor and consultant whose mission is to improve people's lives one business at a time. With a background that spans veterinary medicine, dairy technology, and entrepreneurship, Bruce has a deep understanding of both the business and personal aspects of agribusiness management. Together, Jay and Bruce will expertly guide today's discussion. Finally, I want to briefly introduce our panelists, Hannah, Ben, Myron, and Steve. Each of them brings a unique perspective and experience from their own farm transition journeys, and we're incredibly fortunate to have them here today to share their insights. Please note that this session is being recorded, and there will be an opportunity for audience Q&A later in the discussion. With that, let's get started. Jay?
Well, first of all, I want to thank National Milk for inviting us to do this. Transition, to me, it's a topic that it's a very important topic and one that probably doesn't get talked about enough. As Teresa said, I've spent kind of my career helping guide families and agribusinesses through transition. So it's something that I'm passionate about and something that I think is very, very critical to the ongoing success of production agriculture here in our country. So the way this is going to work is I'm just going to roll through a few slides, kind of give you some of our thoughts around transition, how we view it, and then that'll probably take 20, 30 minutes. And then, as Teresa said, we'll get our panelists up here, and Bruce and I will co-facilitate a panel discussion. So when I think about transition, oftentimes we think about just the ownership and management transition, but I tend to look at it a little bit more broadly in terms of there's really 5 types of transitions that at one point or another, every farm business is going to go through. So the first one obviously is the one that gets the most press. It's the generational transition or the transition of ownership of a family business from one generation to the next. The second would be the transition of management. In agriculture, we tend to view ownership and management as kind of one and the same. We're a lot of owner operators. And so when we talk transition, it's hard for us to break the ownership piece and the management piece apart and think about those transitions kind of separately. That's one thing that I am very, very, very committed to doing when I work with clients is we're not going to have one transition conversation. We're actually going to have 2. We're going to have to talk about how do we transition ownership and what that looks like, and then separately have a conversation about how we transition management and what that looks like, okay? The third type of transition, and it's kind of intuitive, but the natural life cycle of a business, there's really 4 stages of any business. When you're first starting up, it's all about surviving. Then you get to a point where you're pretty stable, you're mature, and then you have a decision to make. Do you want to continue to grow that business and what they call professionalize it? So maybe that involves hiring in some non-family members in key positions, maybe even let non-family members into an ownership capacity. And then the last step would be institutionalization. So when we think about transition, not only are we talking about ownership and management, but over the life cycle of a business, how do we transition from one stage of a business's life to the next stage? Okay. The fourth would be a strategic transition. So, say you start out as a row crop farmer, and row crop farming isn't very good. So you figure, okay, what do we need to do to make money to keep this thing going? Well, you maybe get into dairy farming or feed some cattle or something. And so that, in my mind, is a very strategic transition. You're in one line of business and you've consciously made a decision to get into another line of business. And so the process that we walk clients through, whether it's a ownership, management, stage of business, line of business, or the last one, financial transition, it's all the same. The process is applicable to all 5 types of transitions that we work clients with and through. And if at any point during this, anybody has any questions, I am not the guy that stands up here and talks at you. I would much rather have a conversation, okay? So just raise your hand and we'll address those as we go. So when I talk about the transition process, I'm a very visual guy, and so I like to think in pictures. And so somebody challenged me a couple years ago to say, okay, you always talk about this process of transition, but what does it actually look like? So I literally had just to pull out a piece of paper and a pen and just kind of wrote it out. And so in my mind and in Bridgeforth's mind, any type of transition we go through, this process is applicable. And we start up at the top, and it all starts with a conversation. And then we move to putting it on paper. Then we communicate it to our key people, right? So that's the planning portion of transition process. And then we move into the execution phase where we have to start it, we've got to complete it, and then we've got to reflect on it. So we very much view transition as a process, and oftentimes it can be multi-year or even multi-decade process of transitioning either from one generation to the next, one management team to the next, one stage of business to the next. It's not something you just wake up in 6 months, you're like, okay, we want to transition and it's done. That's not how this works. So like I said, there's a strategy component to it where we plan the plan. There's an execution component where we actually do the plan. So the first step is number one, just to get people talking. In my experience, most people, they know intuitively, okay, we need to start working on a transition plan. They just don't know where to start, right? So to me, the most important thing, and quite frankly, the most time-consuming thing, is this first step, number one, just to start getting people to thinking about, okay, what do we want this transition plan to look like at the end? And what are the conversations that we need to have now to set ourselves up in a good way for the next 5 steps of this process? Okay, so hardest part is getting people to start talking. The second part would be is actually, once we've kind of discussed what we want the transition to look like, we've got some feedback from key people. I have a saying that I use with clients: if it's not on paper, it doesn't exist. So for me, I guess let me take a step back. Has anybody ever heard this concept about how people take in information differently, whether they're visual, whether they're auditory, or whether they're kinesthetic? To me, the documentation piece, I'm a visual learner. Does anybody know the percentage of the population in the US that are visual learners versus auditory or kinesthetic? Anybody know that percentage? 2/3. So 2/3 of us here in the US, we learn by seeing. We don't learn by hearing. So if all we ever do is talk about something and don't actually take the time to put it on paper and either write it out or draw it out, 2/3 of us aren't going to actually absorb that information. So this is why, in my opinion, it's not enough just to talk about it. We actually have to put it on paper and to document it so people can see it to absorb it. And then the last part is to communicate it with all the key external stakeholders. So there's a number of people surrounding every business that can either make or break a transition. So if you're the founder, if you're the guy, if you're the one that started the business, ran the business for 40 years, and in your mind, you've got what you want your transition plan to look like, but you don't share it with anybody, you don't document it, how successful do you think that transition plan is going to be? Probably not very good, right? So in order to get people aligned and headed towards the same direction, we actually have to tell them where the hell we're going, right? So once we've planned the plan, now it's time to start doing the plan. So the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So to me, you can't start or you can't finish what you never start, right? So we can have the best laid plan, everybody's on board, but if we don't actually put that plan into action and to initiation, we're never going to get there. So most people, they spend all this time and energy trying to figure out what the perfect plan is, and then when it comes time to actually start executing, it's like they lose their mojo. Like they don't, for whatever reason, they don't ever really just like commit and take action on it. So to me, yes, we've got to come up with a good plan, document it, communicate it, and then we've got to start. And obviously, if you start it, you better finish it, right? So there's no job that can be done well if it's not done at all, right? So we've got to complete it. And last but not least, and I think this is where I think there's a lot of insight that can be learned. This is an iterative process. You're probably not going to get it right on the first try. And so to me, the last step is one of the most important steps to go along with number 1 and number 6. So number 6 is reflection. So we need to really take a step back and think about, okay, we've got this plan, we started executing it, we've completed it. Now, what did we learn? What worked well? What didn't work well? So that the next time we want to work on a transition, we've got some stuff figured out. So key learnings. So these are just some of the things that as I've helped families transition, whether it was generational or management or financial transitions that I've worked families through over the years, last 20 years essentially. These are some of the key learnings that as I was thinking about information to present that could be valuable to this group, these are some of the things that came to mind. So the KISS principle. To me, simple beats complex every time. We can have the most complex plan laid out, but if we can't actually execute it because it's too complex, it's not going to be successful. So I would rather have a plan that we can execute that's maybe a little bit too simple and not perfect because we can actually get it done as compared to the perfect plan that's so complex that we stall out mid execution. So simple beats complex. Number 2, inclusion drives ownership. So how many people in this room love to be told what to do? You're in agriculture, so I'm going to guess everybody's hand should have gone up because we are independent by nature, right? And so the more people you can include in formulating what you want your transition plan to look like, the greater the likelihood that it's going to be successful because those people that need to be part of it now own it, right? So if we're relying on one person to tell us here's what's going to happen, and everybody else isn't included in the conversations and included in the formulation of a plan, it's probably not going to be successful, right? So inclusion drives ownership. How about this third one? What do you guys think about that one? Is it harder to step away or step up? I'm a little bit outspoken on this, probably too outspoken on this. As an industry, we do a hell of a good job of trying to prepare the next generation to step up, but we do an absolutely terrible job trying to prepare the current generation to step away when it's time. I think that's a huge opportunity for this industry that we can learn. Which 3 and 4 kind of go hand in hand. Is it harder to give away cash or harder to give away control? If you're the guy in the seat, if you're the founder, if you've built this business, which is harder to give away? The control, right? So that's why I think when I think about transition and the hardest parts of transition, the transition of ownership, that's pretty easy, really. I mean, you get your attorneys, you get your CPAs, they come up with a tax efficient plan. We transfer ownership, life goes on, right? To me, the harder part of transition is the management piece and the control and the decision making and the day-to-day. That is by far, in my opinion, where most people have the biggest struggle. It's not the transition of ownership, it's the transition of management decision making. Control over cash. How about this next one, number 5? How many of us want to avoid adversity and conflict? Yeah, you're honest. But when you think back to some of the most valuable learning experiences of your life, did they come when times were good or when times were pretty tough? Probably when times were pretty tough. You had to figure some stuff out, right? So we spend a lot of time and energy trying to avoid adversity and trying to avoid conflict. I think that's the exact opposite thing we should not be doing. We should actually be seeking out some adversity and creating some conflict. It's healthy, in my opinion, to mix it up and to get real feelings out on the table so we can align, so we can move forward. So adversity and health and conflict are healthy. And if you're going through some of that during a transition, that's normal. That's good. It doesn't mean that you're screwing it up. Hannah, you listening? All right, just checking. And last but not least, this tends to be a little bit controversial amongst family businesses, where we think that the only goal, is to pass the farm from one generation to the next. I'm here to say sometimes that's the absolute worst thing to do. That succession is not success. Pretty self-explanatory on that one. So best practices. Over the years I've learned that every good football team needs what? Exactly. You can't win the Super Bowl if you don't have Patrick Mahomes. Go Chiefs. Chiefs. Yes. So when I think about transition in the professionals that you can engage to work with you through the transition, I think about it like a sports team, football team, which is where I got this analogy because, so I view the professionals, CPAs, attorneys, insurance folks, they're what I call skill position players. They're your running backs, your tight ends, your wide receivers, right? So they're very, very good at taking the ball and running with it. But what I've found over the years is it's really hard to get a skill position player to be the quarterback, to distribute the ball to everybody that needs the ball needs distributed to. So to me, if you can find somebody that can actually manage the process and work with those skill position players, your accountants, your attorneys, your insurance folks, the process goes so much smoother. So find a good quarterback. Number 2 is, this is a very, very small industry. We've got relationships. Phone a friend. You know, there's not a shortage of people that have gone through this before you, that if you just picked up the phone and called and asked them for their advice, what went well, what didn't go well, what should I do, what should I avoid doing? Like, you can get a lot of good feedback if you just take the time and, quite frankly, take the risk to pick up the phone and call some people. So phone a friend. So I also have this saying that I use with clients: if you show me your calendar, I'll show you your priorities. So what's not on the calendar doesn't get done. So if transition is truly a priority to you, there needs to be something on your calendar where you're checking in with yourself and your team either quarterly or at a bare minimum annually to see, okay, here's the plan that we laid out. How are we performing according to plan? Like if you never schedule time to do a checkup, trust me, your transition's not gonna work. Like if it's a priority, you gotta make it one. You gotta schedule it. I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. It's what I call keep the piles separate. So when we talk about transition, we talk about ownership as one conversation, and put that over there. We talk about management as a separate conversation. Most people in agriculture, they're owner-operators, so they tend to view ownership and management, especially in production agriculture, as one of the same. And I'm here to say we've got to take and bust them apart. Just because you're an owner doesn't mean you should be the guy running it. Just because you're the guy running it doesn't mean you need to be the owner. Like we've got to bust them apart. Keep the files separate. And 4 and 5 kind of tie together too, because the skills of being a good owner and the skills of being a good manager, they don't always transfer, they don't always translate. And so we have to really take a critical view, especially of our next generation, and be honest with ourselves to say, do they have the skills required to be an owner? Yeah, maybe. Do they have the skills required to be a manager? Maybe, maybe not. So it kind of cuts both ways. So we've got to be very diligent on how we actually look at the skills of the people that we want to be our successors, to set them up for success instead of set them up for failure. Number 6, take time away. So when I say take time away, I mean this kind of in 2 different contexts. So you don't have to raise your hand, but just be thinking to yourself, how many of you have a time away policy for your next generation? Meaning, once they go to trade school or university or do something after high school, they can't just immediately come back to the farm and start working. They have to go away and become a good employee for somebody else for a period of time before they're allowed to come back. I think that's a very, very, very valuable thing to do. Because if they're a shitty employee for somebody else, guess what? They're going to be a really shitty employee for you. So take time away. But then also, when I say, and dairy's unique, 24/7, 365, it doesn't sleep, right? And so if you don't consciously schedule time to take a step back so you can actually look at the business instead of what I call get sucked into the operational vortex of the dairy, do you really think you're gonna make good decisions if you don't ever consciously take a step back and just take time away from the business so you can actually think about the business versus how do we get all this stuff done operationally? Make sense? Yeah. Number 7, I get a little bit of flack for this one. Write a check. So I don't care if it's buying shares in a family business or education or a car. If you have something given to you, do you value it the same as if you had to save money and actually write a check for it? I think making somebody actually literally write a check to buy in is one of the healthiest things we can do to facilitate a successful transition. I'm big with sayings with clients. I have this saying with clients: if it's given away, at some point it'll be taken away. Because the next generation may not have developed the skills and the grit, the fortitude to be able to take this business and make it successful. Right? If something's just handed to you and you didn't earn it, I think you're setting people up for failure. So write a check. Maybe not full value, right? I'm not about selling it to the highest bidder kind of thing. But if you need to make your next generation put some skin in the game, some actual skin in the game. And number 8, just because it's tax efficient doesn't mean you should do it. Usually what I've found is the most tax efficient thing to do creates unnecessary complexity when it comes to management and operations. So don't just listen to your accountant. Push back on them a little bit. Think about the business, not just how do I get out of paying Uncle Sam. That's not the goal. The goal is to set the business up for success, not to defer taxes inevitably. So a few closing thoughts. How many people have been led to believe that your business is your legacy? We like to talk about that in agriculture. I think it's BS. Your farm business is not your legacy. Your family, the people you impact, your relationships, that's your true legacy. Your business may be the mechanism to do that, but at the end of the day, the business is just assets. It's relationships that is your legacy. Number 2, how many people, when you go to an event like this, they ask you what you do, say, I'm a dairy farmer. I'm here to tell you, your activity is not 100% of your identity. Yeah, you may be a dairy farmer, but that's not all you are. So don't get tricked into believing that your business is your only legacy and your activity is your identity. No, to me, I think that's one of the things that I think really hurts transitions is when somebody has their entire identity wrapped up in what they do on a daily basis. When it comes time to transition, you're asking that person to essentially say, well, I have to recreate an identity and give up the one that I just spent the last 50 years building. I think that's one of the biggest challenges with why it's so hard getting some people to step away and hand things off, is because their whole identity is wrapped up in what they do. They're a farmer. You can be more than that. You are more than that. Number 3 is, families, businesses, and especially the dairy industry, it evolves and it evolves fast. So we have to be pretty flexible. So our plans have to evolve also. So just because you put a plan in place and you start executing it, circumstances change. There's nothing that says you can't go back to the starting block and recreate the plan if it doesn't fit anymore. So just because you get it and you start executing it, if things change and we need to adjust, be willing to adjust. And there's no such thing as staying steady, right? We're either making progress and moving forward, or we're falling behind. And I'll kind of end here where I started. Transition is a process. And with any good process, there has to be an owner of it, and somebody's got to be accountable for it. And so, it's kind of like musical chairs. What's the number 1 rule of musical chairs? 2 people can't sit in one seat. Just like if 2 people are in charge, nobody's in charge. So one person needs to be kind of the pilot for this process. They need to own it. And if you don't have that, you need to find that. Doesn't have, maybe not even has to be somebody within your family or your business. You can hire that done. Shoot, I've done that for several people where I'm the guy that holds everybody accountable to getting their stuff done. So just because you don't want to do it doesn't mean there aren't resources out there that can help you. And last but not least, if your family and your business are a priority, you need to make transition planning a priority and execute. Like I said, if it's not on your calendar, is it truly a priority? So if you guys are interested, I'll just leave this up there. You can scan the QR code. We've got some transition readiness assessments, some business infrastructure assessments. So if you want to log on and fill out some surveys to kind of give you a guide on where you're at and how ready you are or aren't to start walking through this transition process, this could be a good tool for you to use. So with that, my portion is done. Bruce, panelists, let's get this thing going.
Well, good morning. I'm Bruce Vande. It's really good to be here with you today. We've got a panel that we've selected, and it's all about transition planning. So every person on this panel has gone through a transition. And what we want to do is we want to get people who had been on both ends of the transition, right? So the people who were the transferors, right? So they were either the senior generation or the people who had the assets, whatever, they're transferring management or ownership or some of the things that you heard Jay talk about. And then there's two people on the other side of that transition who were the incoming on that side. We also wanted to have people who had successful transitions and some who maybe didn't quite have as successful a transition, so that we could see both sides. So this is a conversation today. I'm going to ask the questions, they'll respond, they're free to interact with each other, and raise your hand, right? So if you've got a question, go ahead and let me know. I'll repeat it so the whole audience can hear it. And so I'm going to do a brief introduction of who we have here. We've got Vince Smith, Northern Virginia dairyman, correct? And he is on the transferee side, correct, of the column. Myron Check from Minnesota, and all dairy farmers, right? By the way, we're dairy groups, make sure we set that stage right away. Transferer side of the operation to his, one of his sons, correct, in Minnesota. Hannah Smith is currently in Washington, Sunnyside, managing a dairy, and had a transfer that didn't quite go as well as expected. And Steeg on the transferer side from Kansas, and has his sons that come in. Okay, so that's where we're at. We're gonna do like a quick lightning round. We're gonna go through, and I want you to tell me, was the transfer bumpy or smooth, successful or unsuccessful? Go ahead, Ben.
Good morning. I tell everybody I didn't know exactly what our transition plan was going to be until it was done, and then I started talking about it to people. But overall, I feel like it went smooth and simple.
I would have to say very smooth. Our first transition was 18 years ago to our son, and we're still we're partners to this day. And we also have kind of two parts to it. We're also the transferee. We did, as a group, became the purchasers of another farm who we were the transferees to just in the last year and a half. And that also went quite smooth.
I would say right now our transition plan is in a holding stage, and what I mean by that is my family farm is in Iowa. We have decided, my husband and I who are on the farm are taking a break from that currently, which is why we're in Sunnyside, Washington. So right now it's been very bumpy, and we will speak more on that as we go along.
We did a transition, I guess, back in '07 with two of the boys, and then another one just a few years later. And overall, it's gone very well, and it's still going good.
All right. So one of the points that Jay made towards the end was about the transferor generation and that giving up control, right? And one of the things I find is that there's this role change, and how do we do that, and what am I going to go do? So I want to talk to both Steve and Myron. As you were looking at that transition, as the younger generation, in your guys' case, wanted to come in, what was it like for you to think about, I've been doing this for X number of years, and I love it, and now I've got to start handing over some of these roles. What was that? What did that transition like in your mind as I'm going to let some rope out, if you will, or change my job, or whatever? Myron, go ahead and start with that one.
Sure. I learned early on when I had about my second employee that a good way to keep an employee is to let them pick and choose kind of what their specialty or what their interest is. So that kind of prepped me that when my son was ready to enter, that we kind of let him navigate his way into what he thought, or the things that he liked to do, the management parts that he liked. And I kind of stepped back into some things that, fortunately for me, were things that I liked as well in business. So I specialized more, and my workload changed a lot. I stepped away completely from the management of the dairy, the day-to-day management. I gave up the thing I loved the most early on, which was the genetics part. And anybody that's a Holstein breeder knows that's a tough one to give up. So once I broke through that and gave that up, I realized I could probably give up other things too and still be happy. And I'm very happy with what I do now. I do agronomy work and accounting work for the farm.
So let me follow up on that. So it sounds like there's an intentionality to what you're thinking. And somehow you found joy in something else. What was that like?
Well, I've always liked, I was brought up that, as we both were back in the 70s and 80s, that a good dairy farmer knows how to do everything on the farm. You do your own mechanical work, you raise your own crops, all your own feed. If you have to buy hay or silage, you're not doing your job right. So that's the background that I came from. You have to be good at all positions on the farm. And I early on figured out that maybe wasn't the way to go, because there's other people that are better that can do certain jobs. So that kind of led me into the segregating work and assigning jobs to other people. And when you start taking on employees that are really talented, you have to give them something challenging.
So you pick up that. What was it like for you to transition roles?
At first it was kind of tough, but I guess had been really blessed. I actually went into partnership with my dad in my early 20s. I bought into the business, and he was really good about turning a lot of things over to me at an early age. And as I got older and started bringing my boys in, I really saw that as a benefit, the way it benefited me. And so it was still a little tough, but it made it easier to step away from some of those roles, because I was kind of the same way, growing up, you did everything. I mean, you were the manager, you were the breeder, the finance guy, crop guy. So, but just having that experience early on in life, I think helped transition better for me.
Okay. So, Ben and Hannah, I want to turn it not completely 180, but I want you to think about the perspective of you're young, you're excited, you got energy, right? And everything I've heard is like, man, I've got ideas, and I want to get my ideas out there. Did you think about what it was like for the generation ahead of you to have to transition to give you room? And if so, was there any thought put there at all, or were you just kind of like, man, we're charging ahead and going for it? Ben?
I didn't have to think too much about it, because my dad let me know pretty quick how he was feeling about things. That's one thing he's good at, is just getting it off his chest right away. So I remember one day I was changing the landscape in there because it was just growing up, and he let me know he still owned the farm, and that was his landscape, and it was okay. So, I got it, I understood, and now that we've transitioned, I see it, my dad, like you, was really into the genetics, and so am I. And he had a hard time stepping away from that. So instead of asking him to do that or making him do that, he's still making breeding decisions, and we're picking bulls together, and still trying to make him feel like he's a part of it. But he also had other things to do. His identity was more than dairy farming. It was ice cream and row crops and being a part of the Dairy Alliance, and he had other things going on, but his passion was the genetics. So he's still involved in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess for us, so our farm was split 50-50 between my dad and uncle. So we knew one side was maybe more eager to transition than the other. So we were ready to go in and talk to that person guns a-blazing. We had our list of 10 to 15 things of like, hey, let's talk about this, let's move forward. Whereas we know we needed to kind of hedge things a little bit differently on the other side, because they were maybe a little bit more hesitant to the transition and wanting to move things forward. So we kind of had to go about things differently when talking to that party, just because we felt as if they weren't necessarily ready to transition yet. So again, I think it was understanding the personalities in the room, because we had a lot of different personalities in the room, which can be really good at times, but can be really kind of detrimental at others.
So back to Ben and Hannah, what were the things that you were actually looking forward to doing? Why did you want to get into this family business? And what did you want to do? Where did you see yourself going? Go ahead, Hannah, start.
Yeah, I think for me, I just saw the passion my family had growing up with it. I watched my grandpa work at the farm. I watched multiple family members come in, and just growing up on a farm, you naturally have that love for it. And so when you go to school and you learn all these new things that you can do, you ultimately think of how can I bring that back to the farm. And then again, my husband and I were very fortunate that we also had careers in the dairy industry before we went back. So we were traveling and we were doing sales on some of the best farms in the Midwest. So again, every time that we saw these great farms, we would talk about how those could be implemented into our family businesses. And that's, I think, ultimately, we knew we'd always end up in the dairy industry. But again, when you see that love and that passion your family has, you ultimately want to go back and continue to grow that further.
Great, Ben.
Yeah, and to echo kind of what Hannah said, it was a very similar situation. Like my grandfather started the farm and moved it from Maryland to Virginia in the 70s, and he grew it. Later, my granddad grew it, and I remember when we were milking 200 cows in a double six, and now we're milking 830 cows in a rotary. So just being a part of that growth and watching my dad and granddad grow it, go through the highs and the lows, and my parents were always really good about getting out and getting off the farm. So when we went to the Northeast or the Midwest or even here to Expo, I started coming to Expo when I was 14 or 15. You see these other progressive farms, and the ride back home, we would talk about what we can do to get to that point. And I think that's one of the things I like most about dairy farming is that it's always a challenge, and there's always room to excel and grow and be better. And I think the best part about it is you can directly do that. You don't have to, or in our situation, you don't have to report back to a board or a committee and ask if you can do this. You can just get up and make it happen. And the legacy, it's important that we keep Cool on farm going.
So what were some of the awkward conversations, or what was the elephant in the room as you guys, let's start with Ben and Hannah, as you're thinking about approaching this with the ownership of the farm, what was difficult about engaging in that conversation? Go ahead, Ben.
That's a tough question. I think we all knew what we wanted. I wanted to ultimately own the dairy operation, and my parents ultimately wanted to see that happen. I think the elephant in the room is I've got 4 sisters and 1 brother-in-law that's actively involved in the farm. My younger sister, she's in charge of the creamery and the ice cream shop. My brother-in-law, he was more on the agronomy side, and just to keep it short, I think that was how to manage expectations from everybody.
Yep.
And I think some of the awkward conversations are admitting there's an end, that basically the people that have to transition have to ultimately decide at some point they have to be done. So for us on our side, my dad and uncle, when asked, what are your hobbies? What do you like to do outside of the farm? Every answer went back to, well, it's farming. Like, we just love farming. So again, I think that's an awkward conversation to have, because if you don't have something outside of the farm, what are you going to do when you're done? And then obviously it's already been touched, but the financials. To have to sit and talk about money is difficult. To sit and talk about, are there additional people, whether it's family members or not, that are involved in the farm that shouldn't be there? Those again are some of the hardest conversations to have. And again, my family, with how the business was split, my uncle did the cropping side, did the business side. My dad only worried about the cows. So if I asked him a business question, he had no idea. So again, to get him into a room and say, now we have to have these tough conversations, we probably should have had 10 years ago, because you should have understood the financial piece of the farm, was tough to do.
So you said something that struck me, because I'm an older guy now. And if you had to ask me what my hobbies were, I have a shop full of stuff that I think I like to collect tools more than actually use them. This is what my wife would say. I like to work. So does the older generation need to be put out to pasture, or can they actually find something to do on the farm?
Well, I think for us, a conversation that we had is, up until my grandpa passed away, he was always on the farm. He had tasks to do, but maybe wasn't in charge of those tasks necessarily. We gave him little projects to keep him busy. And we've said from day one, just because we're having these conversations or starting to have these transition conversations, that doesn't mean you're done here. We envision you here in 20, 30 years having coffee in the morning, but maybe not going out to work in the barns or having to go, sit in the chopper, things like that. We still envision you here. And so we told them over and over, just because we're having these conversations doesn't mean you hand us the keys tomorrow and you're done. We will always see you having a role here in this dairy.
Steve, what is the awkward conversations you guys have to have?
Oh, kind of probably some of it just, how we delegate things, the time off, the different things like that. Some of the money situations were a little awkward at times. But once we got all that stuff talked about and figured out, it went well.
Okay. Byron, how about your family?
Well, I would say we had most of the usual things. But if you want a specific point that's really awkward to talk about,
Yep.
it was my son and myself were both in the same position as far as being engaged to be married about the time we were transitioning. So my parents had mentioned, you realize that if you get married and, if you don't have a prenup or whatever, that, there could be issues if you get a divorce. We kind of talked about it, and I said, well, I can't ever see that happening, and that was the last time we talked about it. And that was really 50 years ago. And then we kind of briefly talked about it with our son, and he's been married for many, many years, and it doesn't seem to be a problem, but it's an awkward thing to talk about, and we seem to be okay in that department though, without having any real, anything ironclad or written on it.
Well, they say that being in business or a partnership is a lot like being married. There's just no love. So communication becomes a little more crucial, doesn't it?
I guess I have something to kind of echo on that, because now that you bring up the marriage conversation, I remember this conversation vividly as we sat down with my family, and I remember my dad and uncle both pointing at me saying, well, your family, your husband's not, he's not blood. So that was a conversation that we had to have as well as, what happens, because he was the one that was, the herdsman on the farm at the time was the one that was full-time there, and I was working off the farm in dairy nutrition. And again, that's an awkward conversation you don't think about at the time until someone mentions it.
So let's just keep stepping into the tough stuff, right? So a lot of the younger clients I've worked with, and I think it doesn't matter what generation you're in right now. I think every generation looks at the generation behind them, to some extent. There's a generality. They're a little bit entitled. And oftentimes they've worked on a farm their whole life, and oftentimes they've worked on the farm for not a whole lot of money, and maybe in a sub kind of par house because great grandpa lived in it, like it was just there. And so there's this thing of I've earned my sweat equity. So how did y'all handle either that conversation or the money part about, as Jake mentioned, they ought to write a check. Because if you don't put any money in, any skin in, you're often not as committed. How'd that go? Let's start with you, Steve.
That's something that when I saw that question, I guess in our situation it was a little different. When our boys, as they grew up, they owned cows at an early age, for their FFA projects and different things, and kind of, grew some of those numbers. So when we did our transition, they actually, at different amounts, but they had some equity in cows, and one of them had even started renting some ground and bought a few pieces of equipment. So, when we decided that what we did, we sold 20% interest in the business to the boys is what we did. And then what we did was figure out what their equity was worth, minus what the cost to them to buy them was going to be, and then they, made payments on that over so many years. So, as far as what equity, it's very, very important, but in our situation, it was just a little different, just because they had always been on the payroll too, I guess, per se.
So sounds like then they were paid enough to be able to either buy cows or rent ground, or there's ability to go generate enough income instead of like, hey, if you work for $10 an hour, someday I'll pay you the other 10 to make 20.
Right, I mean, they were always, treated fairly, and they come in at a pretty early age. I think Justin was 24, Kyler was 22, so, pretty much right out of school. I couldn't get my boys to go away and work someplace else. In fact, Kyler, we couldn't hardly get him to a second year of junior college, so they wouldn't come home so bad. So whatever I did, I must have done something right, I guess.
Go ahead, Martin.
I would like to just make a comment on one of Jay's points on his slides, and it pertains to, like you said, about your sons. You had trouble getting them to go away to work. I'm a big fan of internships and getting experience on another farm. But remember what you do. If let's say, excuse me, if you have a policy that says that, and I know people that do, that your child, before they come back to your farm, have to work off the farm in a different job for 3 years. So if they graduate from college, they're say 22 years old. And if you want them to work on a farm, you want them to work on probably a larger and a more successful farm, somebody about your own age that might have kids your own age, your own kids' age. To 22-year-old single person, what might happen? You might be providing the heir to take over the other farm. And I've seen that happen too. So it has to be very strategic when you do it.
So are you talking like a non-arranged marriage on somebody else's farm? You gotta come home, is that what I'm hearing?
Right, we don't need to provide someone else.
But is this a competitive environment here?
I thought I'd just make that point. And then on the compensation thing, to change gears back to the question. My partner, my son, takes a very modest salary from the business. In fact, we have several employees that make more money than he does. But when I started farming, the barometer that I measured my business by each quarter was my net worth gain. And being he's a 50% owner in the business, his net worth gain is quite large each quarter. And I think, I'm led to believe he's adopted my same philosophy that net worth gain is very important to him too. So that's kind of his compensation. You can see his net worth gain each quarter.
Okay, so you set something up differently at the front end.
Yep.
Can you describe what that was like? Because he had to agree to a smaller salary in order to get this net worth gain. So what made that attractive to him and work for you?
Well, because we didn't start by doing anything with our home farm, I kept my home business. It's a site that can't be grown anymore. It's 800 feet off the Mississippi River, trouble getting permits and so forth. So I provided the equity to borrow the money to, at 100% financing, buy another dairy. So we both started on that farm on an equal basis, as my wife and I is 50% and him is 50%. So all the gain we make is split 50%. That farm is paying its own debt off and coming along nicely. And he realizes the gain from day one.
So in that instance, if you had 100% collateral was on your other farm.
Correct.
Did you guys split your mortgage payments, or did you earn some interest off of that? Because if things went south, he lost nothing and you lost the farm.
I pretty much bit the bullet and took the risk.
Okay. All right. So let's flip around the other side. And as you're looking at coming in, what was your view of, hey, how should I buy this, or should I have worked here my whole life? How did you see that? And then go ahead and answer that one first, and then I'll jump to the second one.
So I felt like I was always fairly paid and compensated for my time and energy at the farm. What might not have been compensated and would be a form of sweat equity was the late nights, the weekends, the things you missed out on growing up because you were at the farm. But I always made it known that I aspired to own the dairy operation and continue to keep it going. But I never expected it or really put my future in my dad's hands and, hey, I'm expecting this. So I think in 2015, 2014, I bought 167 acres with FSA and farm credit. 2019, a few years later, I bought another 88 acres, same situation. They had just renewed the farm bill so that put more money in there that was available to young farmers. So I made it known that I wanted to farm, but I never did expect them to give me the opportunity. I wanted it, of course, and was hopeful for that. But one thing for sure is I was going to farm, whether it was, my parents' help or not. I was trying to get something going on my own, and with the idea, well, if this doesn't work out, I've got something to fall back on. And if it does work out, great. I've expanded my land base on my own. And I guess my dad never really thought I was going to do it. I said, hey, this ground for sale is for sale down the road. Well, you want to co-sign? And he's just, yeah, sure. And then a couple weeks later, I got approved on, I need you to sign here. And then tied up his credit and equity for 2 years until I could get some tax credit money and conservation money. And yeah, he was just surprised that I made it happen. So I don't know. And then you go off to school, you're in high school, you're going away for internships. I did all that. But the farm was still there. He was running it without me. So for him to make a position and pay me $50,000 a year at the time to come back, I had to bring some value, right? Because everything was going okay without me. So that value that I found to bring back and to cover my salary was pretty easy. He wasn't achieving his somatic cell and PI premiums, and I made that happen. And that more than paid for my salary, added more to the bottom line. So I think that's important, that if somebody's going to come back, they have to pay their salary and then some and add value.
So to follow up on that, then how did your family then structure a buy-in for you to come in?
I'm very thankful my dad had $1 million worth of tax credits that were about to expire in 2022, and he wasn't going to lose those. So that was really the big push on his end, that we need to get this transition done. Otherwise, he was going to owe a lot in taxes. So that's really what I'm thankful for, those tax credits. We talked about a partnership. We talked about going to a corporation and doing shares. We talked about buying the livestock and some dairy equipment and renting the facilities and the land. But to me and to them, that was more or less just kicking the can down the road. Okay, can you manage this for 5 years? And in 5 years, we'll talk about selling you the real estate. Well, who knows? Somebody could pass away in 5 years, and it could be a different situation. And what they wanted for rent on the facilities and kind of the first couple options, for a few more $1,000s, I could pay the mortgage. Has it made things tight? Yeah, but I think in 20 years, I'm going to be glad I did it.
So let's talk about, what was the role in your mind as you're trying to come to the family businesses? Buy-in, you got there are two partners. What did it look like as you guys had those conversations?
Yeah, so as we had those conversations, originally what they wanted to do is, again, my husband was on the dairy full-time, I was part-time at the dairy and then working off the farm. So they originally had said, hey, we're gonna pay your husband this salary and we're gonna do sweat equity. And I guess maybe from my standpoint, I was a little apprehensive just because it was my family that we were going into. And yes, all of the things that your family's good at, but their faults as well. And maybe where some hesitations would come in place. And again, one of ours there was actually a family member ahead of me that was at this farm that chose to walk away based on some business structure and things there. So I said, nope, sweat equity's off the table because we deserve to be here for 1 year to 2 years, just working as employees and understanding how you guys make the decisions you do. So again, right away we started, I think after 6 months, we had cattle that we had purchased right away. So we bought around 30 head. And that was kind of our investment into the dairy. The next steps, again, we never got to that just because the transition wasn't working at the time, was going to be purchasing land or renting land from the farm. And then also our business is set up as an LLC, so determining the price of shares and solely buying shares at the time. Again, we never got to that, but originally we just started with buying those cattle.
So can you go into, you never got to that.
Yes.
Can you jump into that and just kind of help the audience go, this is a tough spot?
Yeah, it was a very tough spot. I say all the time, one of the hardest things that I had to do was to walk away. Because your dream and everything that you wanted is sitting right there. We lived on the farm, so every day I said my dream is sitting there within arm's reach distance, but I've never felt so far away from it. And I think a lot of it was establishing those peer groups, so calling people that, again, maybe had successful transitions, people that had unsuccessful transitions and talking to them and explaining, you know, the situation that we were in. And constantly we kept saying, we're still willing to fight. We're still willing to fight to be here. And we got to a point where everyone that we were talking to in our peer group said, well, what are you fighting for? Because it sounds like you're willing to fight and they're not. And a lot of it was, again, if it's a priority, you'll make the time for it. And we were just trying to get to a point where we can have a monthly meeting with my dad and uncle to discuss, you know, business opportunities, the state of the business. We couldn't even get them to do that. And so I guess for us, that was kind of a little bit of a red flag of, if we can't sit down once a month and discuss where we're going, how can we ever get to the future? So again, very, very difficult conversations were had there. We constantly asked the state of the finances of the farm. We're never given those, no matter how much we asked. We were given rounded, rough numbers. And I kept saying to them, you don't walk in to buy a car and they say there's roughly 120,000 miles on it, or roughly 50,000, or it's roughly had the tires done around this time, things like that. That's not something that happens. But again, they were expecting us to come into the situation and handle those numbers, which again is kind of alarming for us. But yeah, like I said, still the hardest thing that we've ever had to do. We are keeping the door open. So as we left, we said, you know, right now we're on a dairy in Washington, which we've learned so much in that time. I would make the decision a million times to do what we did this way, because we've learned so much. But I hope someday, I told my dad the day we left, I said, I hope we can all sit back in 5 to 10 years and laugh that this is what it has come to. Now we had to walk away in order to come back to make this business better. But yeah, that's kind of the rough story of how it happened.
Can you have Christmas together?
I'm hoping so. Again, it's a little bit of a rough conversation because I have a younger sister that's maybe interested in the farm. So before we left, I sat down with my dad and my sister and me, because I said, you know, she deserves to hear what happened. Because somewhere between what I say and what you say is really the truth. So I'm not gonna sit in a room and try to make me sound like we did everything right, because we did things wrong too. And I don't want it to be that way from you as well. So let's sit down and talk. So before we left, I said, we are family. I remember every rough conversation we had as family. I started every meeting the same. I said, when we walk in here, you're not my husband, you're not my dad, you're not my uncle, you're all my business partners. However, when we leave this, we're all family. So let's all behave accordingly in the room. And when I left, I thought we left on really good terms. I would still contact my family, things like that. However, I have not heard from my dad since we moved. It's been 4 or 5 months. I still reach out to him. I've been home a couple times for work, called, don't hear answers, don't hear things on my birthday, you know, still tell him Happy Father's Day, things like that, because we are family. But I hope someday time heals all wounds and we can come back and we can all be family. Again, I choose to have a positive mindset with it, but we'll see what time tells.
A lot of stuff. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate that. Did y'all have people who assisted you in your transition? Steve, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, and actually, you know, it took us a little while to kind of figure out who to turn to. You know, we started working a little bit with our lender at the time, and then he got us on to a attorney type accountant that we started having meetings with, going through some things, kind of writing down our expectations, and you know, trying to kind of come up with a plan that way finally. And that's kind of how we started.
Okay. Ben, how about you guys?
We had some really good help. I'd say one of the biggest help was Matt Lang at the time. He was with Cooperators Financial. Now he's got his own business, Integral, I believe it's called, and he's an independent dairy consultant now. But he was really good because as he said, I represent the farm. You know, I've got expectations. My parents had expectations, but in reality, what can the farm afford to support to give everybody what they want, or tell us where we need to compromise? And he took the emotion out of it. He was a third party that said, this is what the farm can support. You guys need to come down here and price, or Ben, you know, this isn't going to work for you. And he was a big help. Farm Credit was a big help. They financed everything. And, along with that, they offered a lot of good advice, but we didn't exactly meet their ratios at first. And I went somewhere else for lending and got approved, and Farm Credit acted right after that. So sometimes you have to do that, you know. Let them know that there's other people in the room. And colleagues, so some buddies from college that were going through similar situations. And my dad has some peers that are his age around the country that, you know, have done it.
Martin, pick that up.
Sure, we had a great financial advisor and a great banker. Those are two key things in any business, and especially in farming. Everybody in this room knows that. Our financial advisor was a guy who happened to be my ag teacher in high school, who then became a financial advisor, and he helped us draw up all our LLC papers and so forth, and did a great job. Even as I look back and I reviewed them before I came here, just to touch up, and they're still very pertinent, very well done 18 years later. And of course, lenders, we all know that relationship with your lender is kind of sacrosanct. It's got to be, you've got to be tight.
How are your family, Anna?
Yeah, so we had an attorney that we were working with. We actually, when my husband and I bought cattle, put cattle under the same bank and banker that the farm was under, so we could help create a relationship with that banker as well. And then we were constantly bringing in different transition planners to help us with the process. However, I think, you know, one of the red flags for us is every single person we brought in, we probably brought in 3 to 5 transition planners. Either my dad or uncle always found a problem with every single one of them. So again, that was kind of one of the reasons why we left, is after you bring in this many people, there has to be someone that you like or trust. And again, they couldn't do that.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about post-transition, right? We've got 3 in the post side. What are some of the best practices, if you will, that you put into place post-transition to keep this thing rolling well? Myron?
I think the key is communication, and I'm so fortunate in that you know, from early life on, my son and I got along really well, and we still talk several times a day to this day. Just good communication. Not that you're on the same page all the time, but if you're far apart, you keep talking about it until you come together. And far and away, good communication with your partners is absolutely key.
So is it just random? We just talk every day? Are there any set appointments that you have with each other, times to review records or financial? Is there any sort of mechanism to your communication?
It's pretty much just random. Whenever we have a thought, we bring it up to the other person right away. But then we do have organized quarterly meetings, go over our financials and talk about things. We actually put together our own financials with the aid of adult ag instructor. And so we each contribute to them, and we know what goes into them, so we know that we can trust what comes out of them. And but other than that, it's pretty much just whatever topic's on your mind right now, you can call and we'll talk about it.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of like Myron said, you know, that the biggest and the most important thing is communication. That's whether it's in business or family, your marriage or whatever. But a few of the things that we've done, we have weekly owner meetings. We sit down every Thursday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and have an agenda. You know, we go through what's happened the last week, what's coming up, problems that need to be addressed. We also do a monthly managers leadership meeting, which involves the owners plus all of our site managers and key people. And we go through a leadership podcast type of deal. We're following the study thing. Then we also have monthly financial meetings with the owners. We all sit down and go through financials. Here this last year, we actually started doing with the help of Jay's company, we started a family yearly meeting where we bring in all the spouses and sit down and look at financials and different things, which is something we had never done. Which, you know, that's something that's changed too over the years. used to be, just me and my wife, and then we had two of the boys come in, and they were actually both single at the time. One got married, and then the other one got married, and then when the third son come in, married as well. So now you have, 8 people sitting around the table instead of 2. So, that kind of changes the dynamics too. So like I say, communication is just of the utmost important, and there's a lot of different ways to do that.
You mentioned the podcast on leadership. Do you remember what it was called?
I should look that up. It's I cannot think of the guy's name. It's Life Church is an
Oh yeah, yep, Steve Rochelle.
yes.
Craig Rochelle, sorry, Craig Rochelle.
Craig, Craig Rochelle.
Yep. So it's a Craig Rochelle leadership podcast for anybody that's wants to listen. It's excellent, very excellent. With your family, because the communication's kind of just quiet now, right? So
Yeah, and even throughout the whole process, when still we thought there was a chance we could be at that farm, we still didn't have communication. Again, we tried to set up the monthly meetings, that didn't work because somebody always had an excuse of, oh, I'm in the field, or oh, this happened in the barn. And what we had kind of said to them over and over is, now with technology, whether you're in the field or you're in the barn or wherever, we should at least be able to all jump on a phone call, even if it's 15 minutes, just touch base on where things are at. And unfortunately, we live on a dairy farm, so things happen every single day that'll always get in the way. And kind of just to echo what Jay said, if it's a priority, you'll make it happen. And so I think that, again, for us, if we couldn't even have those initial conversations to start, how were we going to get into the tough stuff and through the thick of the transition?
right. Audience, any input, any questions from y'all before we start to wrap this, at least the panel side up? Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, so I work for Crop Organic Valley, which is a cooperative, and we're trying to figure out how do you support farm transitions but not get too deeply into our members' hairy details of their family lives, because that's not quite where we would sit. So one of the things that we're noticing is like this generational shift in values, and I'm curious if you all face that at all when you're in that transition piece. Like, was it difficult when this new generation is coming? Whether that's like an example would be that I've heard, the new generation might be more like, I know I have to work hard, but I also want to be able to go to my kids' soccer games, or I want to like make time for hobbies, is a word that maybe the other generation didn't quite think about. So I'm just curious if you've faced anything around generational.
Let me try and summarize that so everybody in the room
Yeah.
can hear it. So you're asking the panel if the values from each generation are varying, and how they handle this generational shift of work-life balance, if you will, that may be different from theirs.
Yeah, just generational values.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who wants to pick that up?
I'd comment on that a little bit, I guess. Just growing up, at first, with just me and my wife and my dad, we were so busy, and I didn't have time for a lot of things, a lot of the kids' activities. And so we've kind of made that very important, that through this transition that we did and going forward, that our kids had time to, have weekends off, do more things, spend time with their families. So, we've actually put some emphasis on that.
Go ahead, Byron.
Well, as I said earlier, I came from a farm where my dad thought that a farmer needs to know how to do everything. And I think along with that, it was things like not missing a milking of cows in 20 years or things like that went with it too. And even my generation learned that that's not a wise thing to do. And I think I kind of kept that going to the next step. The saw needs to be sharpened every so often, and the more your younger partner can get out and interact with their friends and see new things, I think it only brings value to the company. So I guess I encourage it.
I guess one thing I would say that has been a difference between kind of how my dad operated and I operate is office time. And I find that to be very valuable and important. And I think some of the most money we've made in farming has come from being in the office and not being out there fixing broken equipment, which is still equally important. But he's made the comment to me a few times, you're in the office a lot, but I think staying on top of your financials monthly, and there's a lot of money out there. Sustainability money, or I can go on and on about it, but if you're willing to sit down and do the work, and it takes time, I mean, it will usually pay itself back tenfold. And he has now seen that, and he stopped making comments because we've done a lot in the sustainability space, but it took office time to get there.
So I kind of summarize it. What I'm hearing from you all is there's an intentionality about trying to understand the next generation, and we're all really trying to get the same thing. And so what does that look like for all of us? Is that how you all approached that to some degree? That'd be, and you want to contribute to any of that?
No, I think the office time actually was an interesting piece because now with all the technology that dairies have, when we would spend time looking at the herd monitoring system or tracking rumination from pen to pen, they constantly were like, well, if you're not out looking at the cows, how are you going to find out? And so again, it's kind of adapting to that technology because again, our generation grew up with it where they didn't, they're learning it along the way. And I think too, one piece generationally is, someone at our operation said, we had to struggle through this, so you will have to at some point too. And I think that was kind of a red flag for us because again, farming is not sunshine and rainbows all the time. There's ups and downs that go with it. But I like to take the mentality of you learn from others' mistakes so you don't make them yourself. And again, I think they wanted us to kind of have the same struggles they did a little bit. I could be wrong, I'm speaking for them, but I do see some of that. So again, I think that was like a generational thing, could be wrong, but yeah.
Then a quick second table.
I guess my question for all of you is, how did you measure you were ready to transition? What were the boxes that you had to check off before you said, yeah, we're ready to do this? And maybe, Ann, in your case, what boxes do you feel need to be checked before attempt number 2?
Okay, so the question again is, in order to know when you were ready, what boxes need to be checked? So you went, okay, we're ready to enter into this transition, right? Or for Hannah, when you come back again. Who wants to pick that up?
I can start with that. I think my mic went dead. Can you all hear me? Probably one of the first things is that we were ready to actually, make it happen. And the second thing is that the kids or boys we felt they were very confident and ready to be a part of it. Was probably the second thing that we looked at.
Did that happen all at the same time? Or did they feel they were ready before, or did you feel you were ready? How did that?
Kind of at the same time or hand in hand. I mean, it was always a dream on mine that someday I would have, my boys in the business with us. And I saw that they were very eager to do it and ready to do it. So we went ahead and made it happen.
Yeah. Something.
Yeah, so this is a hypothetical game my husband and I play all the time of what would they have to say for us to come back? Because we know that we're locked into probably 3 to 5 years on the farm that we're at in Washington right now, just because moving 28 and a half hours away is not an easy move. So I think some things for me specifically is I think we have some family members involved in the operation that shouldn't be. So again, some of those family members need to leave. And that's just because there's some issues there. I think for us, we need true farm financials put in front of us. I think we would have to know that they've established meetings that they're having as a business and that they're routinely attending, because again, that was something that we tried very hard to get done and it wasn't happening. We would have to know, again, for a year and a half, they had not established a buy-sell plan that was between the brothers. So again, I think we would need that established too, because our operation is very complex because my dad is divorced, my uncle is divorced, they're both remarried. So there's weird pieces that come into it. So we all the time play, again, this weird hypothetical game of what happens if one of you died, things like that. How would a shift in management happen? And they have no answers for that question. So if one died on the cropping side, what happens? Who's going to run that? Because my dad doesn't know anything about the cropping side or even running the business because he's only focused on the cow side. And again, I think I would need all of those answers beforehand for us to fully make that transition back. Because again, I think some of these things, and again, maybe I'm being naive on the transferee side, but I think some of these things are business questions that should have been answered the day the business was started. And they just, I think, like a lot of families, wanted to avoid all of the hard conversations and say, we'll figure that out if that ever happens. But again, our business has gone through divorces, it has gone through deaths of people that were integral parts of it. And then they tried to figure it all out at that time. So again, that's kind of some of the pieces I think we would need to come back.
It's great.
To me, maybe the only box that needed to be checked was that the heir apparent to your business shows up at your business where you find that person. Doesn't matter if it's family or employee or other. When you have that person who's ready to enter the business, to me is a living thing. And if you want to keep it going, you've got to have that regeneration of the next person or persons to take it over. So if you have a family member that's ready, that's the time to bring them in. That was the key for us.
I think my mom, I think she was ready to transition. She'd always done the book work and kind of the behind the scenes type stuff, and she was ready. My dad, as I previously mentioned, I think it was that expiration of those tax credits that really made him ready. And on my side, I was kind of tired of being an employee. There were some things that I thought could be improved at the farm, and I'd make a comment, well, I've done this, and I would get the response, well, I've done this for 50 years, why don't you pay for it? Well, okay, let me. But I'd actually been at another farm that had a swing 30 milking parlor on it, and I think that was the direction I was looking if something didn't happen.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
For anyone that wants to answer this, whether Jane or you or any of the panelists, when you have somebody that's in management role, whether it's an employee or the next generation of your family that's taking over, and when things are all smooth waters with the farms running smoothly, they're making good management decisions, but as soon as it hits a rough patch, the market's bad, the cows tank, bad feed issue, something like that, and it seems like they just ghost everything, making a decision and go back into what I call just doing chore mode. Have you had that happen, and if so, how do you handle that?
So, a little clarity, so are you talking about this is just an employee that has management responsibilities?
Whether it's an employee, like your key employee that you're looking at potentially transitioning your operation to, or your key family member that you're.
Okay, and then things get rough and they go quiet.
They just stop managing and just do chores.
Okay.
They wanted to make decisions, they're making good decisions when things are good, but then they don't ask for help and they just stop making decisions when things get hard.
Okay, and what if we seen that, and what would we do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of.
Well, Hannah's ready to jump on that.
Yeah. So I guess in our situation, I really wouldn't call it ghosting because we had very little communication to begin with. But when situations got tough, again, my husband was the one that was on the farm, and if no one was making a decision, most of the time, it was him and I talking and say, let's step up and do this for the farm. And again, we'd run it by, the business partners, and they would go, yep, let's do it. Because again, they don't want to have a conversation about it because it would make them actually have to communicate with one another. And so we would make the decision, which we thought was best, and we'd have a whole plan lined out, financial, the manpower, things like that it's going to cost to do this. And that all works great because when things go smooth and your idea works, everybody's happy. And they're like, wow, that was awesome. You guys are really smart. Maybe you are ready to be here at the farm. But when it doesn't, they are very quick to throw the blame on you as like the transferee. We found that if we would make a decision because no one else was, and otherwise it's going to sit. I think you sound like you're speaking from experience, and it'll sit and no one will touch any of that until they really have to. So again, trying to always be proactive to not deal with family kind of crisis. They're quick to blame too. And then when they're quick to blame, they look at you and say, maybe you're not ready for this farm transition. So again, that's kind of what happened at our farm, and just speaking from the experience there. So like I said, I don't really have an answer for you. We again tried to be the ones to step up, and that can go really well, and it can go the opposite as well.
All right, so I'll jump in. So this employee you're talking about has somebody they report to, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I tell my clients is whenever there's an issue, the first person you look at is you. There's almost always multiple areas, if you want to call it blame or reason or whatever. And you as the owner, you as the leader need to go, what is my role in this? Did I really train them well? Have I set in the word, Jay mentioned this, I heard this from every panelist, expectations. We typically fail to set very good expectations. Now, if I'm playing a basketball game, I know what the expectation is. It's to win. And what does winning look like? Well, my score better be more than the next guy. Well, what is that made up of, right? There's assists, there's rebounds, so you know the game. And if they don't have those things set up, then they don't know. And when things get rough, depending on their personality or how they feel with whom they report with, I don't know how this is going to work. Now, that's one component. So you've got to ask yourself first as a leader. The next thing is, if you're a leader, is you got to step into the conflict. Right? Jay mentioned that. We've heard that. You heard conflict in a different word, communication. And I don't necessarily like to step into it. Well, I actually love to step into conflict, except when it's made with somebody like my wife. Then I'm like, and she's called me on the carpet, right? But you got to step into it. Go, what's going on? What's happening? Ask questions. And I learned this a while back. I read this and I went, this is genius. Stop asking why. Because why is like doing this. Why did you do this? And everybody I do that to is going to back up. Why makes you defensive? Ask what or how. What's going on? How did we get here? Tell me more. And flush it out of them, because there may be a way you can support them. They may be in a situation they just don't know how to handle, and they're thinking that you think they should handle it, and they don't know. It could be that they're in over their head, and you promoted them to their level of incompetency, but you just don't know. I think those are the initial conversations to have, and once you learn that, you make the next decision. And I don't know enough to go further. Grab you really talking off the mark, then you should just fire me as your consultant, right? So
I think for us too, again, we weren't making decisions on the farm, but we tried to always be the face of, if the employees had a problem, they can always come to us, knowing that we would take everything right to the owners, because again, we tried to have conversations with them all the time and let them know that whatever they had to say, whether it was a problem on the farm or a problem with their home life of why they could or couldn't get to work, things like that, that we would generally go to the owners and say, hey, your name stays out of it, but we'll address the problem. And I think for us, that made us look like good people to the employees, because we were always willing to help them. But with that, we were trying to reward the good that happened, because we didn't have a training program at our farm. We let employees train other employees, which I'm sure if that's happened on your guys' farm, escalates very quickly. And we tried to reward the good behavior, but we wanted to look at employees as, yes, you're employees, but you're such a vital part of our operation. We need you here. And don't go someplace else because you're stressed out of what's going on. And there were times they would come to us and say, hey, your dad or your uncle aren't communicating with us, and we've tried 10 times, but we don't know how to fix this. And we said, great, let's address it right now. And so just trying to be that person for the employee, I think, made us seem very more valuable to the employees too, because I feel like by the time that we left, we were really respected by all of them. So that's something that we did. Again, I can't say that every problem that we went to the bosses got fixed straight away, but we tried to be those people for the employees.
Other questions? Yeah.
Have any of you dealt with, in your transitions, outside family members that are off farm but expect to be a beneficiary in some way, shape, or form with a farm transition?
Okay. So the question for us is, do you have family members who aren't involved in the operation, they're off farm, but they expect to be beneficiaries or inheritance or whatever in the operation?
I have not.
Okay. I haven't either.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot you.
Have not.
Forgot.
But I think Hannah does.
Yes, so again, I think that's where some of kind of the confusion came in for us, is because we do have these outside people that have been remarried, things like that. So they have kids too. So we would play this hypothetical game all the time because I always say, let's play worst case scenario. So let's play worst case scenario of you die, what happens? Or how are all of these kids involved? Because I think from the transferee standpoint, you have to look at who could your potential business partners be. Again, I love my sisters and things like that, but there's one sister I could not be a business partner with. And so I needed to know if my dad died tomorrow and shares got passed on to us, would I eventually have to be her business partner? Or how is that all set up? Again, my uncle has kids as well, and we have some family members that have never set foot on this farm that get potential ownership. And again, that scared me a little bit. And I wanted to know the buyout plan for them if we ever got to that, because how do you expect to be a business partner with someone that's never spent a day on the farm and they don't know how much time it takes, but they look at it all as a dollar sign? And I think for me, that was a little bit what was difficult because again, I have family members that have said, it doesn't matter to me if I ever do or don't own this business, I'll always have my financial tie to it. And that's a scary thing to hear. And then especially as those people start to get married, their spouses see the dollar signs too. They don't see it as this is a business, this is a livelihood, these are the cows that I care for every day. They don't look at it like that. So again, yes, and it's a scary thing. And again, we never really got to how those people were tied in because we didn't fully work on the transition. But that's a little scary. So I know what you guys are feeling like if you have that going on, because that's a question we ask every day.
Good attorneys can help you clarify a lot of that, right? But it may not be fun if the other generation doesn't want to deal with it. And on that note, you made a comment you had siblings that are involved, like in the ice cream and other part of the operation, but yet you just said there wasn't a problem with that. So can you kind of tell us, how did you end up, you got the dairy, but it's usually dairies are tied into the processing side, but you're not tied into your family somehow.
Right, good question. Thanks for asking for clarification. So we're kind of a couple different entities. We have moved through ice cream, moved through creamery, and then CL Farms, which is the cropping enterprise. My brother-in-law, we do kind of share some duties on the cropping enterprise, but I think there's opportunity for him, and he works in that, to eventually have some ownership there, where I have the cows and the dairy side. And my younger sister, who is involved in the creamery and the ice cream, that's a separate LLC. I think there's opportunity for her to buy in and have some ownership in that. We'll just see what comes with that later on down the road. I know my parents aren't ready to let go of that.
So do you foresee that in the future, because you're gonna need cropping land and you're gonna need a place to ship your milk, and y'all can't sort out the business side, what is as you're looking down the road, tomorrow, 10 years, what do you see?
You're asking all the hard questions.
That's why they pay you the big bucks every day,
right? I'd say that's the biggest question that's going on right now is what's going to happen because, the older generation has been very non-committal on that. And there are some challenges that come with working with family, especially family that maybe has married into the operation. Sometimes there can be challenges with that. So the short answer is I hope everything goes well. I hope we have a good relationship and we can continue to do business together. I guess the negative side of that is I've got enough land base. I think I can support the farm. And there's other crop farmers around to buy commodities from, and that would be worst case scenario. The ice cream side, I think it's really good for our dairy business because the ice cream puts a face with the dairy and vice versa. So we do a lot of tours and it, they just go hand in hand. So I hope that relationship continues forever and grows. Ideally, one day it'd be great if all of my milk could go to ice cream production. I think we're a long way away from that, but that's best case scenario. But I think worst case scenario is each one of these LLCs could be successful on their own, but ideally that's not ideal. I know that, my wife knows that, my brother-in-law and my sister know that. So I think ultimately we'll do what it takes to make it work.
So are you doing anything right now besides hope? I mean, I get hope. I'm a big believer in hope. But to work on actually the relationship with your sister to keep the ice cream thing going instead of like, yeah, it'll happen.
Yes, my sister and I do have conversations, and they're good conversations. I think we both want the same thing, and I think today, as long as we both keep that same goal in mind, we'll make it work. On the flip side, though, our parents are not ready for those conversations. So her and I are trying to, in essence, lay the groundwork for when they are ready for that conversation.
Okay. All right. Other questions?
I got one.
Okay.
How do you start the conversation without making the current generation feel like you're trying to push them out? How did that happen?
Let's start with a few guys that could be facing the conversation or have faced it. How do you feel when that happens? Chris, do you?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
How do you start this conversation around transition? How do you even get people talking about it without making the current generation feel like the younger generation's trying to push them put them out the pasture, as Hannah said earlier?
Let me ask a question for Watson. So how do you start the conversation so that the older generation doesn't feel like they're being pushed out of the business?
Probably choose your words wisely.
What words should you not use?
Get the heck out there.
Make it feel like you're not trying to take control, that you don't think they're doing a good job. Maybe, I guess.
Okay. Myron?
Well, I think in my case, those are words you want to hear. You want to hear your child try to be pushing his way into the business. That's encouraging. That's a good thing.
So what if he says, Dad, why don't you go to Florida, or why don't you start making a boat?
Fortunately, I haven't had that happen because I think we've developed a culture and a relationship where we realize, like I said before, it's a active, live thing, farm is, and there needs to be a generation entering and a generation maybe maintaining to exiting, and you take that as long as you can, and then you bring in refresh it with someone else if you have to. So that's just the way we look at it.
Okay. All right, Ben, come in.
I've learned that there's a right time for communication and a wrong time for communication. When things are going really well, conversations are easier. When things are not going well, it makes it more difficult. But when you're up on top of the bunker throwing tires, it might not be the best time to talk about what we're going to set the price of corn silage at this year. So that's what I learned is the right time and place to have these conversations make a big difference.
Hannah, thoughts?
Yeah, I think for us, my family knew that I was always interested in coming back to the farm. So I guess it was no secret when we decided to start having the conversation. And my dad and uncle both had health challenges, open heart surgeries, things like that. So I just went to them one day and said, you guys aren't getting any younger, and if we hope to transition this business, we have to learn alongside you, because you guys have built this operation to what it is today. And so while you guys are still younger than what you will be, hopefully in 10 years, because I envision them always being there, can we learn alongside you? Because this is not going to be the transition that you did with your dad, where you transitioned 100 cows and a couple acres. We're talking about a whole cropping entity now. We're talking about a transport business. We're talking about the dairy as well. This is going to take time. This is going to be a process. And let's slowly do it versus being forced to do it because something happens to one of you two. And I think he sat back, my dad did originally, and is like, everything that you're saying is correct. And then from there, as we slowly transitioned to having conversations with my uncle as well, because when it started, it started good. I don't want you guys to think like this was just a negative thing the whole time. We started in the right direction and then ended up where we were.
One thing I noticed with my clientele, and I watched this with my father, is everybody needs to have purpose. And if your purpose gets taken away, not your identity, because identity is a different ballgame, but if your purpose gets taken away, you really feel something. And if you take the older generation's purpose away, they're going to push back hard, right? And as they should. Other questions? We got a wrap, Teresa. But let's thank everybody here, right? This is a great thing.
Alrighty, thank you all for joining us for today's important discussion on farm transition planning. I hope you have found the insights from our panelists informative and applicable. We are incredibly grateful to our panelists for their openness in sharing their personal experiences, lessons learned, and valuable advice on navigating farm transitions. I also want to extend a special thank you to our facilitators, Jay and Bruce, for skillfully guiding today's conversation. And of course, we want to acknowledge Farm Credit for their generous sponsorship. Their support makes not only this event, but all of our programming throughout the year possible. NMPF has 2 more sessions that are in the same room today at 10:30, so in about 15 minutes. We'll have the H5N1 Biosecurity and Management Strategies for Dairy Farm session. And then at 1 p.m., we'll have a timely panel discussion on FMMO modernization. Later this evening, if you're still in town, we invite all young farmers to join us for some cocktails and networking at Mint Mark in downtown Madison at 5 p.m. So it'll be a great opportunity to relax and connect with your peers. And if you're still here tomorrow afternoon at 12:30, we will be co-hosting a Tanbark talk with the Dairy Girl Network that's focused on women in dairy leadership. Lastly, if you haven't signed in, please do so before leaving. This will ensure that you receive a link to the recording of today's session, as well as a feedback survey and an option to stay connected with the National YC program and with NMPF. So with that, thank you so much. Again, thank you to our panelists and our speakers.